Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We hope that all of you have just attended the keynote session with Ken Gatz, thoroughly enjoyed it. We'd like to thank you for joining this second session of the day. We're going to cover compliance is key, the guidance update, getting in front of the new regulations. The speaker for this second session is going to be Jonathan Rowe. Jonathan's a principal at ZS and Associates, leading the R&D quality, operations, and risk management practice. In this role, he partners across the industry to design and implement advanced approaches to identifying and mitigating clinical development risk, improving the end-to-end process, study, site, and vendor quality. Jonathan has 25 plus years experience in the industry, and prior to joining ZS in the role that he's in today, he was the head of clinical development quality and risk management advisor. So he's got a wealth of experience in executing clinical trials, overseeing quality, and is also well-versed in the regulatory updates that are coming, both with kind of ICHGCP and then what's coming with ICHGCP, as well as what recently came with E8R1. So he's going to kind of take us through the evolution of the regulatory updates and kind of talk to us about where we're going next and how our industry needs to prepare themselves to be able to be compliant with these new regulations. Before I pass things over to Jonathan, I wanted to take a moment to walk through the console for the session today and help you better navigate so you can see the screen for a great experience, both in this session as well as throughout the RBQM Live event. So what you're going to see here is a window for slides, a window for video, and some more highlights about the speaker, as well as a Q&A box where we encourage all of you to submit questions throughout the session. We'll take some time at the end of this session to go ahead and answer any of those questions that you might have. So if you can just enter them into the Q&A box there, I'll be able to kind of take them and bring them to Jonathan as we go through the presentation today. With all of these windows, you can adjust your preferred viewing sizes to optimize your experience. We've set this up in what we believe to be an optimal way. We're happy for you to leave it as is, but please do know you have some flexibility there to move things around as needed. You'll also notice that you see a take action tool down there at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, allowing us at the end of this session to move directly into the next session today. So with that being said, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't we go ahead and get started if you want to do a bit of an intro and then take us away, sir.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. You already gave me an excellent intro, so I appreciate that. And for everyone who is here, I am going to go through the evolution of the guidelines because I think it's important to know how we got to where we are, and then when you deal with your role or your senior management, you really have the understanding of how the regulatory authorities are trying to push us to a place that some companies are still struggling to get to. So we'll start with the evolution, and I'll take the timelines up to 2019 because after 2019 is when COVID happened, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But we've gone through kind of the first guidelines of risk-based approaches, perhaps starting in 1988, but as I'll show you, actually, we didn't really have anything in 1988. A big gap to 96, a little bit smaller gap to things 2013, and then the papers keep coming out, fast and furious from the regulatory authorities. And we'll go through specific areas of this timeline to get to where we are today. So before RBM, what we had is, and I've got my little video game from 1988, this is all that was really stated for the guideline for monitoring clinical trials. And it said that for any given study, the factors that should be considered in determining the number of monitors and the education, training, and expertise should include, and you look here. So how did we monitor back then? Well, how many investigators were participating? How many sites were there? What was the protocol like? Was it a complex protocol? And think about the nature of the study. There really was nothing in 1988 about a risk-based approach. It was just go monitor. It was a different time. And then it took a long time before ICHGCP came out, the first one. And this is when I started my post-academic pharma career. And this came out, big deal. We had booklets and everything as part of doing clinical trials. And they did have a statement in there, if you look for the word risk, it said the foreseeable risks and inconveniences should be weighted against the benefit for the individual and society. Well, that was actually just a reworking of what it says in the Declaration of Helsinki. So there's nothing there. And the risks that they talk about were really the risks to patient safety and things like that. It was not the kind of GCP risk that we think of today, which although has safety, but we think about data integrity and other things like that. It was really what was in the documents you sent to the IRB to say that you tested the drug in advance and it wasn't risky. And then the only other thing that it said really back then was about the audit plan, where it talked about how you're going to audit. You should think about the level of risks to the trial subjects. And still, that was not critical data and processes. That reflected back to up here are the risks that are anticipated about the drug product itself. So nothing quite there in 1996. And remember, 1996 was, it was quite a long time ago, and we'll start speeding up to the near term. And so since there was no technology or anything like that, what we did back then was, maybe 100% SDV. And some people still do 100% SDV, and I'll be giving a talk on that coming up and why we shouldn't be doing that, but I think you all know that. Anything regarding issues, right? Issues are things that happened, risks are things that didn't, was reactive. And so going around, so things went bad and we scrambled and we tried to fix them. The trials were all pretty resource intensive. If you had 100 sites, you had 20 monitors, and that was really, it. Nobody cared about systemic error, and really was just equal effort. This is how we monitor things. Okay, so we had no tech. It was just to go do the work. And as you know, if you've been around, it really became too much to handle, and the regulators realized that it was too much to try to monitor these growth of trials coming out. And things like complexity of trials were increasing quite a bit. If you look at the number of trials, in 2000, apparently there were, 2,000 and change registered studies, and in 2011, there were over 100,000. And if you go to now to clinicaltrials.gov and look at everything that's, active, enrolling, and so on, there's about 100,000 studies that you find. And, 100% SDV was just you couldn't continue to do that. It was just way too much work, and the return on that investment wasn't that good. We had technology coming out, so maybe we could start doing things different. We went global. And could you imagine if we had to resource monitoring without a risk-based approach in our global settings back then? It would have just been impossible also. And within a company, there was these silo things. Nobody's talking to each other. Hey, statistician, what do you think? Hey, clinician, what do you think? Hey, supply chain person, what do you think? Hey, that wasn't going on. These conversations weren't happening. So we need to get to the risk-based approaches. So let's talk about that evolution beginning in 2013. So now we're back, almost 20 years ago next year. So for those of you, 10 years ago. 20 years ago was me. So about 10 years ago, this came out, and it said, take a risk-based approach. They emphasized, at least on the FDA side, the importance on critical study parameters, okay, rather than let's just go monitor everything. And for the first time, really encouraged centralized monitoring. Okay, and they said we've got a lot of data now, so you can identify sites that have things that that are doing things bad compared to other sites. And they even pointed out maybe they've got a new staff member, and it was kind of very forward thinking, because we know now that staff turnover is a real problem when it comes to risks and so on. So they called that out 10 years ago. The EMA was actually thinking more about the entire clinical trial. So the FDA was thinking about monitoring. EMA was thinking about the entirety of the trial. And they were kind of going to the GMP side with ICHQ9 and Q10, where there was risk management and a QMS. And this was all happening around the same time. How does that, kind of fit into GCP, not just GMP? They brought to the forefront the idea of risk assessment, risk control, risk review, a risk management tool, and communicating. All right, so this was fairly groundbreaking. And they weren't doing it to be a pain. They were doing it to help us. I don't know if it was received that way, but it really was to help us out. So when you look into the guidance from about 10 years ago, and certainly the publication was 2 years early where they were looking for input. So we really had more than 10 years since this first came out. You saw identify critical data and processes. Okay, and these are the things that would jeopardize GCP, patients' rights, safety, welfare, credibility of data. Do a risk assessment, right? We all know about the likelihood, impact, and the detectability. So that was then as well. The use of different monitoring plans, right? You can do on-site monitoring. You can do a different kind of monitoring for things that might be a little more complex. They even talk about, I'll show you later, maybe not monitoring. And then to certainly document everything. So the answer for not doing things 100% was document why you didn't do it 100%, and we're completely cool with that. They do talk about taking a modern risk-based approach. And more importantly, they have the alternative monitoring techniques. Now, if you look back to what was then, it said maybe you can talk to the site via a teleconference or a video conference, send them an email. And I find it kind of funny because during COVID, when we couldn't go to monitor and people were holding up source documents to a video camera or something like that, you know, people are like, can we actually do that? Well, I would go back to this regulation and say, look, you told us we could do teleconference, we can do video conferences, whatever it takes to monitor. Okay, so again, 10 years ago. So some of the things they suggested was, hey, how do we prevent errors? Quality by design kind of stuff. Perhaps you should design a better protocol. Okay, seems obvious, but they called it out. Maybe the CRFs should be written in a way that you can't make mistakes. Okay, again, seems obvious. When it comes to the investigator sites, you know, think about for feasibility. As the investigator, do they have experience? What's their workload? Okay, do the staff understand their responsibilities? And they specifically point out for training communication, you can do less on-site visits and you can think about other ways of getting feedback from the sites. And at the time, they called out teleconferences and webcasts. We didn't have Zoom 10 years ago. Okay, so again, thinking about it is pretty forward thinking from 10 years ago. My favorite things about the guidelines, one of my favorite ones is up here. You see this all the time. The use of the word should means it's suggested, but not required. And you know, how many times have you been inspected and they start talking about stuff and you're like, you said should, so I don't want to do it. So I always laugh at that. So should to me is always you have to do it. Important, especially, you know, CluePoints, you know, can say this 1,000 times over. Risk-based approach does not suggest less vigilance. All right. And if you go back then, people were scared about risk-based approaches. You know, are we going to be able to find things, whatever? It doesn't suggest less vigilance. It says thinking on the things that would be critical to you being able to deliver the protocol and overseeing GCP. And they've recommended a quality risk management approach, which they're going to work on as of 10 years ago in an upcoming document, which eventually they did. So important to point out, I really like these lines here from the guidance. So it talks about for major efficacy trials, companies typically conduct on-site monitoring visits with an approximate interval. So they're acknowledging that, you know, you have this one-size-fit-all thing. But they do say, at least partly because of the perception that frequent on-site monitoring visits with 100% SDV has been the FDA's preferred way of monitoring, right? It was the sponsor's perception. The FDA is saying, we never really asked you to do that. And then they go on to say where they have had studies where no regular on-site monitoring was done, and they use centralized or other methods to carry the study forward. So they came forward and said, you don't have to do things the way you've been doing things. You could find completely other ways. You don't even have to go, which freaked people out for those who've been around a while. Now, the EMA in 2013 had their kind of quality management at the trial level. So the FDA was the monitoring level. They did point out risk identification, establish what really matters. They brought up quality tolerance limits. So this was prior to ICHGCP. So folks like, where did quality tolerance limits come from? Came from here. That's where it came out. And the risk-based quality management principle was pretty straightforward. Reliability of results, right? Not reliability and credibility and so on. It doesn't have to be integrity. Some people interpret that as 100% results are great. we're going to have mistakes. And well-being of trial subjects, GCP. Okay, they do say, the basic idea of risk-based quality management is identifying risk on a continuous basis. It should start at protocol design, so you can build in mitigations. Okay, this is where all these things started to come together from their onset into E6R2. Again, my favorite excerpts from their document. They did say current practices in clinical research are not proportional nor well adapted to achieving the desired goal. They called out the risk aversion of sponsors. So society and its institutions, they're increasingly risk averse with little appreciation of the actual or relative risk of activities, leading to imbalanced or disproportionate risk mitigation. So what might that be? It might be 100% SDD. Yeah, we can't miss anything. Okay. Then, they go through where they say, I like this, the regulatory environment may be overinterpreted or misunderstood. That was a shout out again to sponsors saying, what are you doing? We don't need you to do all these things when you deliver your trials. Take a risk-based approach. They talk about the lack of understanding of risk management tools at the time, and the fact that these issues are embedded in the culture of the organizations. So if you can go back to 2013, you probably go, yeah. And maybe it's still present in your current organization. All right, the culture does not want to take a risk-based approach. So if you were working at the time, you'll remember that there were barriers to adopting risk-based monitoring, risk-based approaches, because the company said, I want to see the first product that gets approved where they use an RBM methodology, right? They're waiting for somebody else, thinking that the regulators were going to shoot them down. Okay, so the barriers at the time, everyone wanted to monitor all the data points. Folks didn't actually understand what RBM was. They thought the tools were complicated or they didn't have any tools. There was a misconception about it. Oh, it's going to be too much work. We don't know how much work it's going to be. The regulators aren't going to like it. We don't want to try something new. And I wrote here the fear of unemployment. There are folks who had these massive monitoring organizations who were like, well, what does that mean for my people? Okay. And then, of course, we didn't really have the ability to track RBM outcomes and things like that yet. So 6 years later, the FDA came back out with guidance addressing questions. And if you read this document, you can kind of laugh and think that the regulators wrote this going, what is wrong with sponsors that they do not understand what we asked in 2013? So one of the questions was to address the sponsors, what's the purpose of a risk assessment, and should sponsors document their methodologies and activities for assessing risk? This was like are you seriously? People ask this question? And a lot of these answers were seriously, people had this question. Of course you need to document your activities. But it seemed like, the sponsors were acting like children that didn't want to follow the rules and what their questions were. And so they answered the questions. Yes, you should perform a risk assessment and anything that's around critical data and processes. You should identify the reasons for missing data and, investigate things in real time and on and on. So it's a great document to look back, which is only a couple of years ago. But so much has happened since 2019 that you could take it in an interesting light now. And that interesting light, of course, was, and this is a paper which I've footnoted over here, when you look at, and this is a data from CROs. It was a landscape survey to look at how many studies were doing an RBM or an RBQM component in 2019, and then how many were doing them in 2020. Do I really think that this was a natural evolution? No, we know what happened. It took COVID to get all this to really kick off. Otherwise, I think we would have been floating maybe around 60% or something. But that was the big thing where everyone said, now we have to do this because we can't send people on site. We can't do other things. We need to do better feasibility and so on. the interesting thing about it was, what from this paper, what were the things, the RBQM approaches? Well, we went from ongoing studies in 2019, risk assessments. Well, not just about everybody to risk assessment. And ongoing risk assessments, just about everyone's doing it. In terms of QTLs, not everyone was there yet. Okay, coming up with specific KRIs, not everyone's there yet. Central monitoring, not every study's there yet, but maybe, maybe not every study is big enough to need it, or, but still, we'd like to see this get larger. Remote monitoring, not sure why everyone's not doing this. Reduced SDR, reduced SDV. So there's still a lot of work to be done in the SDV space, but you can see that, that's kicking up as well. And we'll see, hopefully they repeat this study in a couple of years. So I'm going to skip over ICHG6R2 because everyone probably memorized that inside out. Of course you did. So let's go look forward now. And we talk about looking at now. So I tried to rhyme, let's say, the MHRA. Is that brilliant? Maybe not. But if you didn't see, in 2002, this year, back in January, MHRA came out with their risk-based approach to clinical trials and risk assessment. And like the word should that we saw from the FDA, MHRA uses the word recommended. Okay, Ray, I recommend means do it. I recommend you clean your room. Yeah, kids, clean your room. So it's recommended that a risk assessment is undertaken for all trials. So this is where, most of us are at, where we're getting really good with a RAC tool or some other kind of integrated quality risk management plan. So this is important. They do talk about, if you're conducting a lot of trials, document for how the risk assessment is being done. So if you don't have an SOP for this, highly recommend it. Okay. Purpose is to take a consistent approach. The risk assessment must be specific to the proposed trial. All right. So this is not a checkbox exercise. This is not a cut and paste exercise. You can have a template, right? So it calls it a template to help consider things there, but you really need to focus on the risks of the proposed trial because there may be things you haven't considered in the past. It's a bespoke approach. Do the risk assessment as early as possible. You can definitely have to have it done during draft protocol. There are some people who may work their way back to even protocol concept. That might be a little bit too early. And they don't care how you do it, but you're going to have to do it. They also talk about who should be around the table when doing this activity. So they have someone from the medical team, someone from maybe the safety team, stats, a person who understands GCP, and read through this again because when I presented this to people, they're going, legal needs to be around the table for a risk management plan. I'm like, no, for God's sakes, no. And I guess we're recording this. But they're really saying is that somebody who understands the regulatory and GCP space. So maybe you have a quality risk manager, clinical quality leads, and so on. Then they go on, hey, maybe you talk to data management, people who actually run the operations. Okay. Interestingly enough, they say it may also be interesting to include patient advocates or representatives in the risk assessment. Now, we certainly try to get patient input in the protocol design. Question is, have we ever thought about bringing patients as part of a risk assessment? And so this is, third tier down, not necessary to do anything yet, but it's something that obviously that they're talking about. And then you need to document who participated. Okay, and so that's one of the things, if you build a RAC tool and so on, it really needs to have who was in there. You need to be able to export it to your TMF for tracking. This is a really neat line. You may choose to put the risk assessment in the protocol, which I think is a good idea, because why wouldn't we want the investigators to know what we are thinking about when it comes to risks to critical data and processes and patients' rights, safety, welfare, and data and credibility. And then finally, basically said, and by the way, we're going to inspect you for this. Okay, the inspectors will be looking at the risk assessment to see it's comprehensive and so on. All right, so this is an inspectable document. So let's go to recent E8R1, the kind of key things. And I'm really only highlighting the risk areas and so on. There's a lot of other changes. So R1 talks about the quality by design approach. Okay, focusing on critical to quality factors to ensure GCP and managing those risks. Okay, so there's a lot of material out there on what are critical to quality factors, and you can build them into your conversations for when you do a protocol risk assessment. They do point out quality is the primary consideration in the execution of the trial. It's a necessary component of the programs. All right, so quality, how we define it, could be the absence of errors that matter. All right, so how do you design a protocol in such a way that if there are errors, they're just not important? And then there are other ways of thinking about it as well, all reflecting back to GCP. So when they get into the QBD component, with identifying critical to quality factors, they actually go into culture first. And you may have at your companies, you know, hey, how are we going to address the culture component? They talk about your culture should be one that supports open dialogue and, you know, and also understanding of the critical things to your trial. So critical thinking and open dialogue. Interestingly enough, it's a lot more than in the past when you might have done quality culture things where there may be a survey that says, you know, I have all the tools I need to ensure quality, or my management behaves in a way that, you know, shows quality. It's got to be bigger than that, and there's different ways of approaching, you know, how do we do this culture thing? Much like the MHRA talked about having a bespoke way for doing risk management, they particularly call out here that one-size-fits-all approaches should be discouraged when thinking about quality by design. While you do need to have SOPs, you know, they're necessary, they're beneficial for overseeing GCP, study-specific strategies are important. All right, so really think about it. And you know, as we get into those areas, if you have an RBM platform, you know, they're going to be standard KRIs that you want to have, but you should also have things that are study specific. To say that, you know, hey, we looked at this and these are the other risk indicators that we may want to put into our RBM plan or something else. So focus on essential activities and engaging stakeholder in study design. So much like the MHRA said who should be around the table, the stakeholders could be interpreted as, you know, should you get sites involved in QBD? Should you get patient representatives involved in QBD? Okay, and they get back into the risk proportionate mitigation to ensure the integrity of the critical to quality factors. Okay, so that's really the whole premise of the document. I only throw this in here just to put a jab at people because I'm kind of like that. And so as you go around sponsors and CROs, you know, where does RBM fit? Sometimes it's owned by data management. Sometimes it's owned by the monitoring group, sometimes someplace else. And so they have a bullet around data management, and you can quickly say, well, look, centralized data monitoring and statistical surveillance belongs in data management. Actually, it doesn't say that. It's just saying what you should do with data management. So if your companies, if you have that battle, it's just something I kind of giggle about. As long as you have this going on and someone owns it, it's important. So R3, what's going to go on with R3? So again, I'm only highlighting things that are related. There's obviously a tremendous amount of changes in the document that they have that's been out looking for opinions to get feedback on. So they do also go into incorporating quality into the design of the trial. It's just different wording from what we're used to, and identifying factors that are critical to the quality of the trial and being proportional to manage that. So that's kind of like Section 5.0 that we're used to, just with different words. They do, again, get to that thing about input from a wide variety of stakeholders. They particularly point out, for example, healthcare professionals and patients. to support the development plan and the clinical trial. I know that I have in my organization, maybe others have it too. We have like apps that allow patients to look at protocols and tell you, hey, I would do that. No, I would never do that. So it kind of makes things a little bit easier, and you can kind of blast it out to 100 patients. And then it talks about getting input when developing the informed consent as well. So I don't know if anyone has ever done this where, hey, we're developing the informed consent documentation. Why don't we talk to a potential trial participant? So again, these are all things that are being suggested. The document everyone's putting input into, this might be stricken, but I just want you to know stuff that's in there. I like this line. I always believe, resourcing for risk and quality was important, and they call out that the sponsor should ensure that sufficient resources are available to conduct the trial. Now, if you're in a quality organization, would you go in, if let's say you're a QA group, and audit and say, hey, you don't think you have enough people? I don't know. That's up to you, but they do call it out. And then, of course, as we've seen in the past, adopting the risk-based approach proportionate to the risks and incorporating quality into the design of the trial. So QBD is, coming up more and more, focusing on GCP and reflecting back to ICHE8. Okay, and again, critical quality factors managed from the protocol design. Okay, it's just different wording of things you kind of knew with a couple of new twists in here. Now, this section here is what used to be the QTL section, but QTL in the draft document is not there. Now, that has some people who I've talked to a little bit up in arms. It's like, we just spent all these years doing QTLs, and you're not going to call it QTLs specifically. So they may give feedback and say put QTLs back in, or what does this broadly say when sponsors should consider setting acceptable ranges? Okay, so those would be your limits, okay, of which variation can be accepted. It's statistical process control in many ways from a GMP perspective. And then when you go beyond the range, then you do what they said in the QTL thing, was an evaluation needs to be considered if there's a possible systemic issue. So we'll see how this comes out. Site monitoring, they just changed the wording, performed in relation to the trial activities. Right, so develop your monitoring plan according to really maybe your risk management plan, which many of us already do. Talking about, maybe it's a pharmacy thing you got to spend your time in, local labs. They get back to on-site or remote, which E6R1 did talk about the variety of things, and they specifically go into secure remote access to source documentation. Okay, so you can do some of that work remotely, which many of us may have been doing, but they call that out too. Centralized monitoring, they put a little more detail of what they consider it to be, looking at accumulated data in a timely manner with qualified people. Those centralized monitors can talk to sites, right? They can train them, they can review documents, and so on. So they call that out a little bit more. They call out also that it's an additional monitoring capability that can complement remote, on-site, and so on. Okay. And centralized monitors can actually make the call and say, hey, here are the sites you need to go to. I think this is what we've been doing, but it's kind of getting codified now. And as long as you do all this stuff, however you do it, just make sure that you document the rationale for your monitoring strategy. So, that's just, kind of things now. And I know we have, about 8 minutes left before my time is up. So kind of what's next? One of the things to think about is, this is my pictorial representation of a GCP QMS. Risk management is a key part of it, but we also have to manage our issues, oversee our vendors, oversee our process quality, be prepared for audits and inspections. Everyone needs to be trained and qualified to work within clinical trials, and document. With risk-based quality management, a lot of data is coming in from the study level, rolling up from the sites. I think of, RBQM as the totality here, RBM bringing up important things from the sites. And as you know, we need to look at risk from the system and the process level. So start thinking about how do you bring all the data really high up. So it's not just about study risk management, but process and vendor for really oversight of the entirety of a QMS. And, you know, I kind of represent that pretty simply in this, as they say in the past, identify risks at the trial and the process level. You know, everyone's really kind of at this level, whether we are rolling up the risks to the asset, you know, is company dependent. If you have the tools to do that, and your sites and your studies all work within your system, which is your vendors and your processes and your QMS. And you can imagine data rolling up and down and risks rolling up and down, where maybe a process owner says, you know what, I own informed consent and we have a translation vendor in South America that we're concerned about. Hey, I'm going to roll that risk down to all of the studies. So if you're doing trials there, just want you to know probability, impact, detectability, keep an eye out on, you know, the way the informed consents were translated and vice versa, things coming up. So systems and tools for doing that is the next step. So it's not too hard to set up these designs. If, you know, you probably have the data at your company where you can triangulate these risks. So if you've ever played the game of Clue, you know, Colonel Mustard in the conservatory with the candlestick, I kind of think, you know, it's this process with this vendor in this study is my highest area I need to support for risk. And, you know, that would be the future state. Also putting into things like geographies, sites, and so on to really understand risk across a QMS and the system. So I'll roll up with that to give some time for any questions. And, you know, thanks so much. I hope this was valuable to you.
Jonathan, thank you so much for that. Fantastic as always. You know, as we were planning RBQM Live 2022, we thought that we should have you on the agenda, and I think that you've delivered mightily there. We do have a number of questions from the audience. I'm going to try to take a couple of them and summarize them into kind of buckets, if you will, just so that we can kind of get through them in the last couple of minutes we have. We also can follow up with everybody who's kind of responded to some questions to get you some additional detail. Jonathan, one of the things you mentioned early on in the presentation was that 100% SDV can lead to even more errors. So the audience was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit or kind of provide some references around that. And then also, I guess, an extension to that to kind of merge in some other questions. There's a number of questions around risk-based approaches, utilization of 100% SDV versus targeted SDV, specific to early phase trials, also specific to like oncology trials. So I guess if you maybe speak to the audience a little bit about those things.
Okay. All right. So I'll try to, that's a lot for me to digest. So tell me if I didn't answer anything. So, you know, what we tend to see as a leading edge thought. Now there have been companies gone to zero SDV. And we can tell stories about things that happen with that. But ideally, when you do a risk assessment, all right, so you do your IQMP or work like that, you should be able to say whether a study is a high, medium, low risk study. And maybe you have a 5-point scale. With that, it should drive what the SDV is you're going to do. Some companies will broadly start off and say, hey, if I'm a high risk study, maybe it's 25% SDV or 100% SDV at the first visit, then 25%, and so on. If I'm a low risk study, maybe it's 100%, then 10% on the next visit, and so on. But then you should be more advanced and tied to what's actually the critical data that you're trying to look at. So there's no reason to go in 100%. The regulators will be just fine if you say, hey, this is the critical data, critical process. It's a high risk study. This is our SOP. We're only going to do X%. And then eventually when we get, you know, EHR to EDC, hopefully you'll have to do no SDV. So that's one way of kind of getting it down. In regard to the 100% SDV and getting errors, this is from an old paper where people aren't perfect when they do things. You know, maybe they miss something. And so you say everything's fine, but it wasn't. And so when I think about false positives and false negatives, and actually, you know, Steve Young, we're going to be putting a paper out on this. Some false positives are okay, where, hey, we think we found a mistake, but actually we were wrong. False negatives are bad, which is, you know, we didn't find any mistakes, but they were there. Right. So I hope that, you know, that answers the question. Was there anything else that Anything to pick up?
It does. It answers it well. I guess the only other thing maybe to speak a minute on is the potential differences of leveraging these approaches on early phase studies in terms of late phase studies. I guess in your experience, are you seeing differences in the approach?
Yeah. So when I was at my role at Pfizer, we took a risk-based approach to phase one, PK/PD trials, things like that, bioequivalence, where we were like, you know what, we don't need to do stuff there. But that's also because we had our own research units. If you're doing a phase one onc with a lot of patients, then you might have to look at that as a real full-blown kind of trial. Certain phase ones, I think you get a pass on.
Okay, excellent. And maybe we can try to do one more here before we kind of finish up the session. There's been a number of questions about the regulators and kind of how they're interpreting this. And I guess the specific question that maybe we can speak to is, do the agencies take into account risk-based approaches with regard to monitoring plans when conducting their audits on sites? Is there anything you kind of can share around that?
Yeah. So from simply what, and hopefully this is a simple answer, as long as you adhere to your SOPs, you're going to be okay. So if your monitoring SOP specifically lays out, when you're going to do remote on-site, an algorithm to it that might be a work instruction, they're going to be okay as long as you adhere to it. So as I showed earlier on from 2013, the regulators even talked about trials where nobody went on site. But you have to do what you said you were going to do and make sure that you document it. And the real right thing to do is you do your integrated quality risk management plan or your RACT or whatever it is. You identify critical data and processes. You build that into your monitoring plan to say these are the things we're going to look at and how you're going to do your centralized monitoring and all that. And you take it forward. And if there is a trigger, what you're going to do about it. And as long as you document that, you're going to be okay.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Jonathan. And maybe we can try to squeeze one more in. And I realize that this might be a big one, but in terms of critical to quality factors, if they're not in the protocol, how do you go about documenting, and do you have any suggestions on ensuring that those factors are communicated to all stakeholders? I know. Yeah,
and if I had the slide. So I don't know if it was CTTI that had one, and there was another document. Actually, ICHGCP, I believe, has it at the end, what they consider to be critical to quality to consider, and the steps along the way. And if anyone wants to email me, I think I have a slide on it. It's part of, for those who facilitate a study risk management, it should be on your cheat sheet for hey, what do we think about this? What do we think about that? It's fairly straightforward. And it's all built around, of course, patients' rights, safety, welfare, integrity of data, the different steps, and the different processes that we do during clinical trials. So I can share that with folks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And with that, I think we probably have a good stopping point. So Jonathan, thank you again so much for the time. Everybody in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. We will anybody who would like a copy of the slides, we can go ahead and get those over to you. If you simply go ahead and click on, contact@CluePoints.com. We'll go ahead and shoot the presentation deck and the recording over to you. I would now like to invite you all to join us for the next session. If you simply go to the Take Action button here on the screen, it'll give you an opportunity to port into the next session that is interpreting QTLs through the lens of what we're seeing today and then their future evolution. And given the point that Jonathan made about the changing in the regulations, I think that's one that's a can't miss. So thank you all for the time. Jonathan, thank you for the participation.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Look forward to
Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, whatever. Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.